The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, Part 1, Section 4, Episode 7. Man and Mythologies. What are here called the gods might almost alternately be called the daydreams. To compare them to dreams is not to deny that dreams can come true. To compare them to travelers' tales is not to deny that they may be true tales, or at least truthful tales. In truth, they are the sort of tales the traveler tells to himself. All this mythological business belongs to the poetical part of man. It seems strangely forgotten nowadays that a myth is a work of imagination and therefore a work of art. It needs a poet to make it. It needs a poet to criticize it. There are more poets than non-poets in the world, as is proved by the popular origin of such legends. As is proved by the popular origin of such legends. But for some reason I have never heard explained, it is only the minority of unpoetical people who are allowed to write critical studies of these popular poems. We do not submit a sonnet to a mathematician or a song to a calculating boy, but we do indulge the equally fantastic idea that folklore can be treated as a science. Unless these things are appreciated artistically, they are not appreciated at all. When the professor is told by the Polynesian that once there was nothing except a great feathered serpent, unless the learned man feels a thrill and a half temptation to wish it were true, he is no judge of such things at all. When he is assured on the best read Indian authority that a primitive hero carried the sun and moon and stars in a box, unless he clasps his hands and almost kicks his legs as a child would at such a charming fancy. He knows nothing about the matter. This test is not nonsensical. Primitive children and barbaric children do laugh and kick like other children, and we must have a certain simplicity to repicture the childhood of the world. When Hiawatha was told by his nurse that a warrior threw his grandmother up to the moon, he laughed like any English child told by his nurse that a cow jumped over the moon. The child sees the joke as well as most men, and better than some scientific men. But the ultimate test even of the fantastic is the appropriateness of the inappropriate, and the test must appear merely arbitrary because it is merely artistic. If any student tells me that the infant Hiawatha only laughed out of respect for tribal custom of sacrificing the aged to economical housekeeping, I say he did not. If any scholar tells me that the cow jumped over the moon only because a heifer was sacrificed to Diana, I answer that it did not. It happened because it is obviously the right thing for a cow to jump over the moon. Mythology is a lost art, one of the few arts that really are lost, but it is an art. The horned moon and the horned moon calf make a harmonious and almost a quiet pattern, and throwing your grandmother into the sky is not good behavior, but it is perfectly good taste. The scientists seldom understand, as artists understand, that one branch of the beautiful is the ugly. They seldom allow for the legitimate liberty of the grotesque. They seldom allow for the legitimate liberty of the grotesque. And they will dismiss a savage myth as merely coarse and clumsy and an evidence of degradation because it has not all the beauty of the herald Mercury new lighted on a heaven-kissing hill, when it really has the beauty of the mock turtle or the mad hatter. It is the supreme proof of a man being prosaic that he always insists on poetry being poetical. Sometimes the humor is in the very subject as well as the style of the fable. The Australian Aborigines, regarded as the rudest of savages, have a story about a giant frog who had swallowed the sea and all the waters of the world, and who was only forced to spill them by being made to laugh. All the animals, with all their antics, passed before him, and like Queen Victoria, he was not amused. He collapsed at last before an eel who stood delicately balanced on the tip of its tail, doubtless with a rather desperate dignity. Any amount of fine, fantastic literature might be made out of that fable. There is philosophy in that vision of the dry world before the beatific deluge of laughter. There is imagination in the mountainous monster erupting like an aqueous volcano. There is plenty of fun in the thought of his goggling visage as the pelican or the penguin passed by. Anyhow, the frog laughed, but the folklore student remains grave. Moreover, even where the fables are inferior as art, they cannot be properly judged by science, still less properly judged as science. Some myths are very crude and queer, like the early drawings of children, but the child is trying to draw. It is nonetheless an error to treat his drawing as if it were a diagram or intended to be a diagram. The student cannot make a scientific statement about the savage because the savage is not making a scientific statement about the world. He is saying something quite different, what might be called the gossip of the gods. We may say, if we like, that it is believed before there is time to examine it. It would be truer to say it is accepted before there is time to believe it. I confess, I doubt the whole theory of the dissemination of myths, or as it commonly is, of one myth. It is true that something in our nature and conditions makes many stories similar, but each of them may be original. One man does not borrow the story from the other man, though he may tell it from the same motive as the other man. It would be easy to apply the whole argument about legend to literature and turn it into a vulgar monomania of plagiarism. I would undertake to trace a notion like that of the Golden Bough through individual modern novels as easily as through communal and antiquated myths. I would undertake to find something like a bunch of flowers figuring again and again from the fatal banquet of Becky Sharp to the spray of roses sent by the Princess of Ruritania. But though these flowers may spring from the same soil, it is not the same faded flower that is plunged from hand to hand. These flowers are always fresh. The true origin of all the myths has been discovered much too often. There are too many keys to mythology as there are too many cryptograms in Shakespeare. Everything is phallic, everything is totemistic, everything is seed time, and harvest. Everything is ghosts and grave offerings. Everything is the golden bow of sacrifice. Everything is the sun and moon. Everything is everything. Every folklore student who knew a little more than his own monomania, every man of wider reading and critical culture like Andrew Lang, has practically confessed that the bewilderment of these things left his brain spinning. Yet the whole trouble comes from a man trying to look at these stories from the outside as if they were scientific objects. He has only to look at them from the inside and ask himself how he would begin a story. A story may start with anything and go anywhere. It may start with a bird without the bird being a totem. It may start with the sun without being a solar myth. It is said there are only 10 plots in the world, and there will certainly be common and recurrent elements. Set 10,000 children talking at once and telling taradiddles about what they did in the wood, and it will not be hard to find parallels suggesting sun worship or animal worship. Some of the stories may be pretty and some silly and some perhaps dirty, but they can only be judged as stories. In the modern dialect, they can only be judged aesthetically. It is strange that aesthetics are mere feelings, which is now allowed to usurp where it has no rights at all, to wreck reason with pragmatism and morals with anarchy, is apparently not allowed to give a purely aesthetic judgment on what is obviously a pure aesthetic question. We may be fanciful about everything except fairy tales. Now, the first fact is that the most simple people have the most subtle ideas. Everybody ought to know that, for everybody has been a child. Ignorant as a child is, he knows more than he can say and feels not only atmospheres but fine shades. And in this matter, there are several fine shades. Nobody understands it who has not had what can only be called the ache of the artist to find some sense and some story in the beautiful things he sees. His hunger for secrets and his anger at any tower or tree escaping with its tail untold. He feels that nothing is perfect unless it is personal. Without that, the blind, unconscious beauty of the world stands in its garden like a headless statue. One need only to be a very minor poet to have wrestled with the tower or the tree until it spoke like a titan or a dryad. It is often said that pagan mythology was a personification of the powers of nature. The phrase is true in a sense, but it is very unsatisfactory because it implies that the forces are abstractions and the personification is artificial. Myths are not allegories. Natural powers are not, in this case, abstractions. It is not as if there were a god of gravitation. There may be a genius of the waterfall, but not of mere falling, even less than of mere water. The impersonation is not of something impersonal. The point is that the personality perfects the water with significance. Father Christmas is not an allegory of snow and holly. He is not merely the stuff called snow afterwards artificially given a human form like a snowman. He is something that gives a new meaning to the white world and the evergreens, so that snow itself seems to be warm rather than cold. The test, therefore, is purely imaginative. But imaginative does not mean imaginary. It does not follow that it is all what the moderns call subjective when they mean false. Every true artist does feel consciously or unconsciously that he is touching transcendental truths. Every true artist does feel consciously or unconsciously that he is touching transcendental truths, that his images are shadows of things seen through the veil. In other words, the natural mystic does know that there is something there, something behind the clouds or within the trees, but he believes that the pursuit of beauty is the way to find it, that imagination is a sort of incantation that can call it up. Now, we do not comprehend this process in ourselves, far less in our most remote fellow creatures, and the danger of these things being classified is that they may seem to be comprehended. A really fine work of folklore like the Golden Bough will leave too many readers with the idea, for instance, that this or that story of a giant's or wizard's heart in a casket or a cave only means some stupid and static superstition called the external soul. But we do not know what these things mean simply because we do not know what we ourselves mean when we are moved by them. Suppose somebody in a story says, "Pluck this flower and a princess will die in a castle beyond the sea." We do not know why something stirs in the subconsciousness, or why what is impossible seems almost inevitable. Suppose we read, "And in the hour when the king extinguished the candle, his ships were wrecked far away on the coast of Hebrides." We do not know why the imagination has accepted that image before the reason can reject it, or why such correspondences seem really to correspond to something in the soul. Very deep things in our nature, some dim sense of the dependence of great things upon small, some dark suggestion that the things nearest to us stretch far beyond our power, some sacramental feeling of the magic in material substances, and many more emotions past fading out are in an idea like that of the external soul. The power, even in the midst of savages, is like the power in the metaphors of poets. The soul of such a metaphor is often very emphatically an external soul. The best critics have remarked that in the best poets, the smile is often a picture that seems quite separate from the text. It is as irrelevant as the remote castle to the flower or the Hebridean coast to the candle. Shelley compares the skylark to a young woman on a turret, to a rose embedded in thick foliage, to a series of things that seem to be about as unlike a skylark in the sky as anything we can imagine. I suppose the most potent piece of pure magic in English literature is the much quoted passage in Keats' Nightingale about the casements opening on the perilous foam, and nobody notices that the image seems to come from nowhere, that it appears abruptly after some almost equally irrelevant remarks about truth, and that it has nothing in the world to do with the subject of the poem. If there is one place in the world where nobody could reasonably expect to find a nightingale, it is on a window sill at the seaside. But it is only in the same sense that nobody would expect to find a giant's heart in a casket under the sea. Now, it would be very dangerous to classify the metaphors of the poets. When Shelley says that the cloud will rise like a child from the womb, like a ghost from the tomb, it will be quite possible to call the first a case of the poet's primitive birth myth and the second a survival of the ghost worship which became ancestor worship. But it is the wrong way of dealing with a cloud and is liable to leave the learned in the condition of Polonius, only too ready to think it like a weasel or very like a whale. Two facts follow from the psychology of daydreams, which must be kept in mind throughout their development in mythologies and even religions. First, these imaginative impressions are often strictly local. So far from being abstractions turned into allegories, they are often images almost concentrated into idols. The poet feels the mystery of a particular forest, not of the science of afforestation or the department of woods and forests. He worships the peak of a particular mountain, not the abstract idea of altitude. So we find the God is not merely water but often one special river. He may be the sea because the sea is single like a stream, the river that runs round the world. Ultimately, doubtless, many deities are enlarged into elements, but they are something more than omnipresent. Apollo does not merely dwell wherever the sun shines, his home is on the rock of Delphi. Diana is great enough to be in three places at once, earth and heaven and hell, but greater is Diana of the Ephesians. This localized feeling has its lowest form in the mere fetish or talisman, such as factories put on their motor cars. But it can also harden into something like a high and serious religion where it is connected with high and serious beauties into the gods of the cities or even the gods of the earth. This localized feeling has its lowest form in the mere fetish or talismans such as millionaires put on their motor cars, but it can also harden into something like a high and serious religion where it is connected with high and serious duties into the gods of the city or even the gods of the earth. The second consequence is this, that in these pagan cults there is every shade of sincerity and insincerity. In what sense exactly did an Athenian really think he had to sacrifice to Pallas Athena? What scholar is really certain of the answer? In what sense did Dr. Johnson really think that he had to touch all the patients in the street and that he had to collect orange peel? In what sense does a child really think that he ought to sleep on every alternate paving stone? Two things are at least fairly clear. First, in simpler and less self-conscious time, will be these forms could become more solid without really becoming more serious. Daydreams could be acted in broad daylight with more liberty of artistic expression. But still, perhaps, perhaps, with something of the light step of the somnambulist. Perhaps Dr. Johnson, in an antiquantal, crown him by his kind permission with a garland, and he will move in state under those ancient skies of morning, touching a series of sacred posts carved with the heads of the strange terminal gods that stand at the limits of the land and of the life of man. Make the child free of the marbles and mosaics of some classic temples to play on a whole floor inlaid with squares of black and white. And he will willingly make this fulfillment of his idea and drifting daydream the clear field for a grave and graceful dance. But the posts and the paving stones are little more and little less real than they are under modern limits. They are not really much more serious for being taken seriously. They have the sort of sincerity that they always had, the sincerity of art as a symbol that expresses very real spiritualities under the surface of life. But they are only sincere in the same sense as art, not sincere in the same sense as morality. The eccentrics collection of orange peel may turn to oranges in a Mediterranean festival or to golden apples in a Mediterranean myth, but they are never on the same plane, with the difference between giving the orange to a blind beggar and carefully placing the orange peel so that the beggar may fall and break his leg. Between these two things there is a difference of kind and not of degree. The child does not think it wrong to step on the paving stone as he thinks it wrong to step on the dog's tail. And it is very certain that whatever jest or sentiment or fancy first set Johnson touching the wooden post, he never touched wood with any of the feeling with which he stretched out his hands to the timber of that terrible tree, which was the depth of God and the life of man. As already noted, this does not mean that there was no reality or even no religious sentiment in such a mood. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church has taken over with uproarious success the whole of this particular business of giving people local legends and lighter ceremonial moments. Insofar as all this sort of paganism was innocent and in touch with nature, there is no reason why it should not be patronized by patron saints as much as by pagan gods. And in any case, there are degrees of seriousness in the most natural make-believe. There is all the difference between fancying there are fairies in the wood, which often only means fancying a certain wood as fit for fairies, and really frightening themselves until we walk a mile rather than pass a house we have told ourselves is haunted. Behind all these things is the fact that beauty and terror are very real things and related to a real spiritual world, and to touch them at all, even in doubt or fancy, is to stir the deep things of the soul. We all understand that, and the pagans understood it. The point is that paganism did not really stir the soul except with these doubts and fancies, and the consequence that we today can have little beyond doubts and fancies about paganism. All the best critics agree that all the greatest poets in pagan Hellas, for example, had an altitude towards their gods, which is quite queer and puzzling to men in the Christian era. There seems to be an admitted conflict between the god and the man, but everybody seems to be doubtful about which is the hero and which is the villain. This doubt does not merely apply to a doubter like Euripides in the Bacchae. It applies to a moderate conservative like Sophocles in the Antigone, or even to a regular Tory and reactionary like Aristophanes in the Prox. Sometimes it would seem that the Greeks believed above all things in reverence, only they had nobody to revere. But the point of the puzzle is this, that all this vagueness and variation arise from the fact that the whole thing began in fancy and in dreaming, and that there are no rules of architecture for a castle in the clouds. This is the mighty and branching tree called mythology, which ramifies around the whole world, whose remote branches under separate skies bear like colored birds the costly idols of Asia and the half-baked fetishes of Africa and the fairy kings and princesses of the folk tales of the forest, and buried amid vines and olives the layers of the Latins, and carried on the clouds of Olympus the buoyant supremacy of the gods of grace. These are the myths, and he who has no sympathy with myths has no sympathy with men. But he who has most sympathy with myths will most fully realize that they are not and never were a religion, in the sense that Christianity or even Islam is a religion. They satisfy some of the needs satisfied by religion, and notably the need for doing certain things at certain dates, the need of the twin ideas of festivity and formality. But though they provide a man with a calendar, they do not provide him with a creed. A man did not stand up and say, I believe in Jupiter and Juno and Neptune, etc., as he stands up and says, I believe in God the Father Almighty, and the rest of the Apostles' Creed. Many believed in some and not in others, or more in some and less in others, and only in a very vague poetical sense in any. There was no moment when they were all collected into an orthodox order which men would fight and be tortured to keep intact. Still less did anybody ever say in that fashion, I believe in Odin and Thor and Freya. For outside Olympus, even the Olympian order grows cloudy and chaotic. It seems clear to me that Thor was not a god at all, but a hero. Nothing resembling a religion would picture anybody resembling a god as gossip like a pygmy in a great cavern, that turned out to be the glove of a giant. This is the glorious ignorance called adventure. This is the glorious ignorance called adventure. Thor may have been a great adventurer, but to call him a god is like trying to compare Jehovah with Jack and the Beanstalk. Odin seems to have been a real barbarian chief, possibly of the dark ages after Christianity. Polytheism fades away at its fingers into fairy tales or barbaric memories. It is not a thing like monotheism as held by serious monotheists. By serious monotheists. Again, it does not satisfy the need to cry out on some uplifted name or some noble memory in moments that are truthful, in moments that are themselves noble and uplifted. Such as the birth of a child or the saving of a city. But the name was so used by many to whom it was only a name. Finally, it did satisfy, or rather, it partially satisfied a thing very deep in humanity indeed. The idea of surrendering something as the portion of the unknown powers, of pouring of wine upon the ground, of throwing a ring into the sea in a word of sacrifice. It is the wise and worthy idea of not taking our advantage to the full or putting something in the other balance to ballast our dubious pride, of paying tithes to nature for our Lord. This deep truth of the danger of insolence or being too big for our boots. Runs through all the great Greek tragedies and makes them great, but it runs side by side with an almost cryptic agnosticism about the real nature of the gods to be propitiated, where the gesture of surrender is most significant as the remote castle to the flower or the Hebridean coast to the candle. where that gesture of surrender is most magnificent as among the great Greeks, there is really much more idea than the man will be the better for losing the ox than that the god will be the better for getting it. It is said that in its grosser forms there are often actions grotesquely suggestive of the god really eating the sacrifice. But this fact is falsified by the error that I put first in this note on mythology. It is misunderstanding the psychology of daydreams. A child pretending there is a goblin in a hollow tree will do a crude and material thing, like leaving a piece of cake for him. A poet might do a more dignified and elegant thing like bringing to the god fruits as well as flowers, but the degree of seriousness in both acts may be the same or it may vary in almost any degree. The crude fancy is no more a crude than the ideal fancy is a creed. Certainly, the pagan does not disbelieve like an atheist any more than he believes like a Christian. He feels the presence of powers about which he guesses and invents. Saint Paul said that the Greeks had one altar to an unknown god, but in truth, all their gods were unknown gods. And the real break in history did come when Saint Paul declared to them whom they had ignorantly worshipped. The substance of all such paganism may be summarized thus: it is an attempt to reach the divine reality through the imagination alone. In its own field, reason does not restrain it at all. It is vital to view of all history that reason is something separate from religion, even in the most rational of the civilization. It is only as an afterthought when such cults are decadent or on the defensive that a few Neo-Platonists or a few Brahmins are found trying to rationalize them, and even then only by trying to allegorize them. But in reality, the rivers of mythology and philosophy run parallel and do not mingle till they meet in the sea of Christendom. Simple secularists still talk as if the church had introduced a sort of schism between reason and religion. The truth is that the church was actually the first thing that ever tried to combine reason and religion. There had never before been any such union of the priests and the philosophers. Mythology then sought God through the imagination, or sought truth by means of beauty, in the sense in which beauty includes much of the most grotesque ugliness. But the imagination has its own laws and therefore its own triumphs, which neither logicians nor men of science can understand. It remained true to the imaginative instinct, though a thousand extravagances through every crude cosmic pantomime of a pig eating the moon, or the world being cut out of a cow, through all the digi convolutions and mystic malformations of Asiatic art, through every kind of cracked mirror of mad art that seemed to deform the world and displace the sky, it remained true to something about which there can be no argument, something that makes it possible for some artist of some school to stand suddenly still before that particular deformity and say, "My dream has come true." Therefore, do we all in fact feel that pagan or primitive myths are infinitely suggestive so long as we are wise enough not to inquire what they suggest? Therefore, we all feel what is meant by Prometheus, 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 Prometheus stealing fire from heaven. Therefore, we all feel what is meant by Prometheus stealing fire from heaven until some pig of a pessimist or progressive person explains what it means. Therefore, we all know the meaning of Jack and the beanstalk until we are told. In this sense, it is true that it is the ignorant who accept myths, but only because it is the ignorant who appreciate poems. Imagination has its own laws and triumphs, and a tremendous power began to clothe its images, whether images in the mind or in the mud, whether in the bamboo of the South Sea islands or the marble of the mountains of Hellas. But there was always a trouble in the triumph which in these pages I have tried to analyze in vain. But perhaps I might, in conclusion, state it thus. The crux and crisis is that man found it natural to worship, even natural to worship unnatural things. The posture of the idol might be stiff and strange, but the gesture of the worshipper was generous and beautiful. He not only felt freer when he bent, he actually felt taller when he bowed. Henceforth, anything that took away the gesture of worship would stunt and even mime him forever. Henceforth, being merely secular would be a servitude and an inhibition. If man cannot pray, he is gagged. If he cannot kneel, he is in irons. We therefore feel throughout the whole of paganism a curious double feeling of thirst and distrust. When the man makes the gesture of salutation and of sacrifice, when he pours out the libation or lifts up the sword, he knows he is doing a worthy and a virile thing. He knows he is doing one of the things for which a man was made. His imaginative experiment is therefore justified. His imaginative experiment is therefore justified. But precisely because it began with imagination, there is to the end something of mockery in it, and especially in the object of it. This mockery in the more intense moments of the intellect becomes the almost intolerable irony of Greek tragedy. There seems a disproportion between the priest and the altar, or between the altar and the god. The priest seems more solemn and almost more sacred than the god. All the order of the temple is solid and sane and satisfactory to certain parts of our nature, except the very center of it, which seems strangely mutable and dubious, like a dancing flame. It is the first thought round which the whole has been built, and the first thought is still a fancy and almost a frivolity. In that strange place of meeting, the man seems more statuesque than the statue. He himself can stand forever in the noble and natural attitude of the statue of the praying boy, but whatever name be written on the pedestal, whether Zeus or Ammon or Apollo, the god whom he worships is Proteus. The praying boy may be said to express a need rather than to satisfy a need. It is by a normal and necessary action that his hands are lifted. but it is no less a parable that his hands are empty. About the nature of that need, there will be more to say, but at this point, it may be said that perhaps, after all, this true instinct that prayer and sacrifice are a liberty and an enlargement refers back to that vast and half forgotten conception of universal fatherhood, which we have already seen everywhere fading from the morning sky. This is true, and yet it is not all the truth. There remains an indestructible instinct in the poet, as represented by the pagan, that he is not entirely wrong in localizing his God. It is something in the soul of poetry, if not of pity. And the greatest of poets, when he defined the poet, did not say that he gave us the universe or the absolute or the infinite, but in his own larger language, a local habitation and a name. No poet is merely a pantheist. Those who are counted most pantheistic like Shelley start with some local and particular image as the pagan state. After all, Shelley wrote of the skylark because it was a skylark. You could not issue an imperial or international translation of it for use in South America, in which it was changed to an ostrich. So the mythological imagination moves as it were in circles, hovering either to find a place or to return to it. In a word, mythology is a search. It is something that combines a recurrent desire with a recurrent doubt, mixing a most hungry sincerity in the idea of seeking for a place with a most dark and deep and mysterious levity about all the places found. So far could the lonely imagination lead, and we must turn later to the lonely reason. Nowhere along this road did the two ever travel together. That is where all these things differed from religion or the reality in which these different dimensions met in a sort of solid. They differed from the reality not in what they looked like, but in what they were. A picture may look like a landscape. It may look in every detail exactly like a landscape. The only detail in which it differs is that it is not a landscape. The difference is only that which divides a portrait of Queen Elizabeth from Queen Elizabeth. Only in this mythical and mystical world the portrait could exist before the person, and the portrait was therefore more vague and doubtful. But anybody who has felt and fed on the atmosphere of these myths will know what I mean when I say that in one sense they did not really profess to be realities. The pagans had dreams about realities, and they would have been the first to admit in their own words that some came through the gate of ivory and others through the gate of horn. The dreams do indeed tend to be very vivid dreams when they touch on those tender or tragic things which can really make a sleeper awaken with the sense that his heart has been broken in his sleep. They tend continually to hover over certain passionate themes of meeting and parting, of a life that ends in death, or a death that is the beginning of life. Demeter wanders over a stricken world looking for a stolen child. Isis stretches out her arms over the earth in vain to gather the limbs of Osiris, and there is lamentation upon the hills for Attis and through the woods for Adonis. There mingles with all such mourning the mystical and profound sense that death can be a deliverer and an appeasement, that such death gives us a divine blood for a renovating river, and that all good is found in gathering the broken body of the God. We may truly call this foreshadowing, so long as we remember that foreshadowings are shadows. And the metaphor of a shadow happens to hit very exactly the truth that is very vital here. For a shadow is a shape, a thing which reproduces shape but not texture. These things were something like the real thing, and to say that they were like is to say that they were different. Saying something is like a dog is another way of saying it is not a dog. And it is in this sense of identity that a myth is not a man. Nobody really thought of Isius as a human being. Nobody really thought of Demeter as a historical character. Nobody thought of Adonis as the founder of a church. There was no idea that any one of them had changed the world, but rather that their recurrent death and life bore the sad and beautiful burden of the changelessness of the world. Not one of them was a revolution save in the sense of the revolution of the sun and moon. Their whole meaning is missed if we do not see that they mean the shadows that we are and the shadows that we pursue. In certain sacrificial and communal aspects, they naturally suggest what sort of a God might satisfy them, but they do not profess to be satisfied. Anyone who says they do is a bad judge of poetry. Those who talk about pagan Christs have less sympathy with paganism than with Christianity. Those who call these cults religions and compare them with the certitude and challenge of the church have much less appreciation than we have of what made heathenism human, or of why classic literature is still something that hangs in the air like a song. It is no very human tenderness for the hungry to prove that hunger is the same as food. It is no very genial understanding of youth to argue that hope destroys the need for happiness. And it is utterly unreal to argue that these images in the mind, admired entirely in the abstract, were even in the same world with a living man and a living polity that were worshipped because they were concrete. We might as well say that a boy playing at robbers is the same as a man in his first day in the trenches, or that boys' first fancies about the not impossible she are the same as the sacrament of marriage. They are fundamentally different. Exactly where they are superficially similar, we might almost say they are not the same even when they are the same. They are only different because one is real and the other is not. I do not mean merely that I myself believe that one is true and the other is not. I mean that one was never meant to be true in the same sense as the other. The sense in which it was meant to be true I have tried to suggest vaguely here, but it is undoubtedly very subtle and almost indescribable. It is so subtle that the students who profess to put it up as a rival to our religion miss the whole meaning and purport of their own study. We know better than the scholars, even those of us who are no scholars, what was in that hollow cry that went forth over the dead Adonis, and why the great mother had a daughter wedded to death. We have entered more deeply than they into the Eleusinian mysteries and have passed a higher grade, where gate within gate guarded the wisdom of Orpheus. We know the meaning of all the myths. We know the last secret revealed to the perfect initiate. And it is not the voice of a priest or a prophet saying these things are. It is the voice of a dreamer and an idealist crying, why cannot these things be?